October 25th, 1415, northern France. On a strip of plowed farmland between two small woods, an exhausted, sick, and badly outnumbered English army under King Henry V forms up in the early morning rain. Across the muddy field, ranks of French knights and men-at-arms, heavily armored, confident, and far more numerous, wait to crush them. By the end of the day, those expectations will be turned upside down. This is the Battle of Agincourt, where English longbowmen and mud shattered French chivalry. To understand Agincourt, we have to look at the 100 Years' War. Since 1337, England and France have fought off and on over land, dynastic claims, and the question of who has the right to the French crown. Earlier in the war, English kings like Edward III and the Black Prince won spectacular victories. At Crécy in 1446 and Poitiers in 1456, smaller English armies using longbows and disciplined infantry defeated larger French forces of armored cavalry and nobles. But by the early 1400s, the situation has changed. England has lost most of its gains in France. The war has cooled, but the claims remain. In 1413, Henry V becomes King of England. Young, energetic, and determined, he wants to strengthen his position at home, revive English prestige, and press an old claim to the French throne through his lineage. Diplomatic talks fail. Henry demands large territorial concessions and recognition as heir to the French crown. The French, divided by civil conflict between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, and with their king Charles VI periodically incapacitated by mental illness, refuse. War is back on. In August 1415, Henry V invades France. He lands with perhaps 12,000 men, including men-at-arms and thousands of longbowmen, and lays siege to the port of Harfleur at the mouth of the Seine. The siege is brutal. The French resist stubbornly. The English batter the walls with primitive artillery and mining. Disease, likely dysentery, tears through Henry's army. By the time Harfleur surrenders in late September, the English have suffered heavy losses to illness and combat. Many troops are dead or too sick to fight. Henry has a choice to make. He could stay at Harfleur and consolidate. He could sail home and declare some sort of limited success. Instead, he chooses a bold, risky march to lead his reduced army on a demonstration march across northern France, from Harfleur to Calais, the English stronghold. He hopes to show that he can move through French territory unopposed and perhaps pressure the French into negotiations from a position of prestige. His remaining force is perhaps around 6,000 to 9,000 men, mostly archers. The French, by contrast, are mustering a much larger army to intercept him. As Henry's army moves north through Normandy and Picardy, rain and mud slow the column. They face swollen rivers, broken bridges, and harassing attacks. Food is scarce. The troops are weakened by disease and hunger. French scouts and messengers track Henry's route. Noblemen and knights from all over France answer the call to arms. They want to stop Henry's insolent march, humble the English king, and avenge earlier defeats like Crécy and Poitiers. By late October, French forces moved to block Henry's path to Calais. Near the small village of Agincourt, anglicized as Agincourt, they managed to get ahead of the English and choose their ground. On the night of October 24th, the two armies camp not far apart. The French are confident. They likely outnumber the English by at least 2 or 3 to 1. Some medieval chroniclers claim far more. Their army is rich in heavily armored knights and men-at-arms on foot and horseback. The English are tired, underfed, and many are sick. But Henry holds an advantage that is not obvious at first glance: the ground and the longbow. The battlefield of Agincourt is a narrow, plowed strip of farmland flanked by two woods, the Bois d'Agincourt on one side, the Bois de Tramcourt on the other. Overnight rain turns the freshly worked fields into sticky mud. The available front is relatively narrow. This means the French cannot fully deploy their superior numbers at once. On the morning of October 25, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, Henry draws up his army. He places his dismounted men-at-arms in the center, in tight defensive formations. On both flanks, he positions his archers, each armed with the powerful English longbow, a 6-foot-tall yew-bow capable of sending a bodkin-tipped arrow hundreds of meters and of penetrating or at least damaging armor at closer range. The archers plant pointed wooden stakes in front of their positions, angled toward the enemy to deter cavalry charges. Henry's line is relatively thin but well anchored between the woods. Opposite, the French form up in three main battles, lines of men-at-arms, with mounted units on the flanks. Many French nobles, eager for personal glory, push to be in the front rank. They envision repeating the classic medieval pattern, a crushing advance of knights over weaker infantry. For a time, both sides simply wait. The French delay, perhaps hoping the English, hungry and exhausted, will attack first or be worn down by time. Henry realizes that standing still helps the French. He needs them to come to him across the worst of the mud. So he makes a bold move. Henry orders his army to advance. The English archers and men-at-arms move forward several hundred yards across the muddy ground, just enough to close the distance and bring the French within effective longbow range. Then they halt. Stakes are replanted. From this closer position, Henry's archers begin to fire. Thousands of arrows arc into the sky, then descend on the French front. At first, French men-at-arms stand or kneel with shields and armor, confident they can weather the storm. But it is hard to endure such fire without doing anything. French commanders order the attack. Cavalry on the flanks attempt charges to disrupt the archers and break through the stakes. Under relentless arrow fire, many horses are hit or panic, throwing riders or veering sideways. The attacks on the flanks falter, becoming disorganized. Meanwhile, the main French infantry advance begins. Heavily armored men-at-arms, many in plate and mail, trudge forward across the soaking field. At each step, their feet sink into the mud. Arrows continue to fall. Even when armor stops arrows from killing outright, men are struck, slowed, and disoriented. The ground between the lines becomes a churned, sticky morass. As the French front line approaches the English men-at-arms, the narrowed space between the woods funnels more and more French troops into a tight, compressed mass. Pressed from behind by their own advancing comrades and from the sides by the constricting tree lines, French men-at-arms begin to lose order. When they finally collide with the English line, they are already exhausted, wet, and crammed together. The fight at the front becomes a brutal close-quarters pushing match. Shields, swords, maces, and axes, but in a space so confined and slippery with mud that many fighters can barely swing their weapons. Those who fall have trouble getting up, weighed down by armor and trampled by those behind. English men-at-arms, though fewer, are fresher and more compactly organized. Henry's archers, having loosed most of their arrows, join the melee, rushing in with mallets, short swords, and daggers, attacking from the flanks and edges of the crowded French masses. The French second line tries to come forward, but finds the way blocked by their own struggling, falling comrades. Instead of reinforcing the attack, they add to the crush. In this chaos of mud, armor, and bodies, French numerical superiority counts for little. At one point, amid the confusion, some French forces attack the English baggage in the rear, creating a scare that a new wave of enemies is arriving. Fearing that prisoners might rearm or that his rear is in danger, Henry reportedly orders many of the captured French nobles and men-at-arms to be killed. It's a controversial moment, seen by some chroniclers as harsh, by others as ruthless necessity in the fog of battle. On the main front, however, the decisive pattern is already set. French attacks break down into scattered pockets of resistance. Some knights surrender, others are cut off and surrounded. Henry V himself reportedly fights in the thick of the combat, nearly killed at one point when an axe blow strikes his helmet and knocks it sideways. By late afternoon, the battle is essentially over. The English army, ragged and weary, still stands, with relatively light casualties compared to what might have been expected. The French, despite their superior numbers, have suffered a catastrophe. Hundreds of nobles and knights are dead or captured. Agincourt has become another shock in the long story of the 100 Years' War. In the short term, Henry V emerges as a heroic figure. He returns to England a conquering king, hailed for having led a smaller, weaker army to victory against the odds. In the years that follow, he returns to France with larger forces and greater ambition. By 1420, the Treaty of Troyes recognizes him as heir and regent of France, disinheriting the Dauphin Charles in favor of Henry and his descendants. For a brief period, it looks as if the crowns of England and France may indeed be united under Henry's line. But history is rarely that simple. Henry V dies young in 1422. French resistance revives, most famously under Joan of Arc in the 1420s. By the end of the 100 Years' War, England loses almost all of its territorial holdings in France. Yet Agincourt remains etched into memory. For England, it becomes a story of a pious and determined king, tough professional archers, and tactics and discipline triumphing over numbers and aristocratic pride. For France, it's a lesson in the dangers of disunity, overconfidence, and outdated tactics. Today, the field of Agincourt, now usually spelled Azincourt in French, is peaceful farmland. Crops grow where men once drowned in mud and steel. Small signs and monuments mark the approximate positions of the armies. A museum nearby explains the context and archaeology of the battle. Through chronicles, and later through literature, especially Shakespeare's Henry V with its famous St. Crispin's Day speech, Agincourt has become more than a tactical victory. It's a symbol of how terrain, technology, and leadership can overturn expectations. How an outnumbered, exhausted army can still win if the ground favors them and their enemies underestimate what that means. You've been watching Agincourt 1415, outnumbered English longbowmen versus French knights. For more cinematic, battlefield-focused history documentaries, subscribe, like, and explore our other videos. History's turning points are not only found in empires and revolutions, but also on narrow, muddy fields like Agincourt, where arrows and rain decided the fate of kings.